During World War II, families didn't ask what's for dinner. They asked what hasn't spoiled yet. There were no refrigerators humming in the background, no grocery stores with backup generators, just blackout curtains, cracked cellar floors, and silence. When food lines vanished and ration books stopped mattering, civilians turned to methods older than machines. No power, no packaging, just knowledge passed down by those who knew how to stretch a single loaf through winter. They sealed meat in oil. They buried eggs in sand. They turned basements into living pantries. These weren't survival hobbies. These were wartime necessities. Because when the trucks stop coming and the cold sets in, you either know how to keep food alive, or you watch your family fade with it. These are 7 genius WW2 food tricks that kept people fed year-round, without power, without help, and without a second chance. Your fridge is temporary, but this knowledge, it lasts. Subscribe before history disappears again. Number 1. Underground root cellars. When the bombs fell and the lights died, the soil became more than shelter. It became storage. Across war-torn Europe, from the fields of Ukraine to the outskirts of Norwich, families who could no longer rely on refrigeration turned to the oldest cold chain on Earth, the ground beneath their feet. Root cellars weren't luxury, they were a necessity. Dug deep into hillsides, barns, or even the basements of destroyed homes, these underground chambers held steady temperatures year-round, cool in summer, unfrozen in winter. Inside, civilians stored potatoes, turnips, onions, carrots, beets, apples, foods that didn't just feed, but stored calories across brutal months. The science wasn't complex, but it was crucial. Moisture had to be controlled, airflow had to be managed, and vermin had to be kept out. Families lined walls with brick or stone and packed straw into gaps. Shelves were raised above the floor to avoid moisture pooling. Apples were wrapped individually in newspaper. Potatoes were layered between dry hay. Onions were braided and hung from ceiling beams. Nothing was thrown together. Everything was placed with care, because the wrong placement meant rot, and rot meant hunger. Some civilians converted coal bunkers into root cellars. Others buried barrels in the earth, layering produce inside with dry ash or sand. In remote Finland, families cut cellars directly into permafrost, creating natural refrigeration chambers. In England's countryside, evacuee families relied on inherited cellar spaces from earlier wars. Many had been used since the 1800s. But the cellars weren't foolproof. Flooding could destroy stores overnight. Temperature swings in shallow pits could lead to sprouting or spoilage. And if ventilation was blocked, entire batches would mildew. For that reason, most cellars had adjustable vent holes or wooden trapdoors, low-tech systems to balance airflow and insulation. Regular inspections were vital. Families checked their stock weekly, rotating anything near spoilage to the cooking pot immediately. Still, when it worked, a well-kept cellar became the difference between food security and famine. It required no electricity, no fuel, just earth, discipline, and timing. Children learned to check for soft spots. Grandmothers tracked moisture by touch. Fathers shoveled ice to widen pits. The cellar was cold, but it meant life. Not every home had one, but every family who did held an edge when the blackout stretched into spring. Could your basement save your table if the grid vanished tomorrow? Think before it's too late. Subscribe for what they never forgot. Number 2. Egg storage in sand or lime water. Before the war, an egg lasted a week. After the war began, it had to last a year. With cold storage gone and supply lines failing, civilians across Europe turned to forgotten preservation methods. Techniques older than electricity, but still trusted by those who knew survival, didn't wait for modern solutions. One of the most reliable, storing fresh eggs in dry sand or lime water. Farmers, mothers, and homemakers buried unwashed eggs, point side down, inside large ceramic crocks or wooden barrels filled with sterilized sand. Others soaked them in a mixture of slaked lime and water, creating a mineral barrier that sealed the porous shell. In both cases, the goal was simple: block oxygen, starve bacteria, stop rot. When done right, these eggs stayed fresh for 6 to 12 nights on 12 months, long enough to survive a winter without laying hens or ration stamps. In rural Poland and the outskirts of Austria, sand-filled crates were stacked in cellars and pantries. Each egg is placed by hand, never touching another. Lime water barrels were sealed and hidden beneath floorboards or kitchen hearths. Families checked them monthly, rotating the oldest to the top. This wasn't emergency food, it was insurance. A guarantee that protein wouldn't vanish when markets went dark. But precision mattered. Only clean, unwashed eggs with intact shells could be used. Washing removed the natural elasm that protected them. Sand had to be kiln-dried or oven-baked to kill moisture and pests. Lime water had to be balanced. Too strong and shells would weaken. Too weak and bacteria would win. In the French countryside, some women marked each egg with the date and hen's name, tracking freshness without refrigeration. In Norway, families kept barrels buried near wells where stable temperatures acted like a primitive fridge, and in the hardest winters, those eggs became the centerpiece of a meal. Boiled, baked into bread, fried with whatever fat could be spared. This method required no electricity, no ice, just knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter, often scrawled on yellowed notebooks or remembered only through practice. And yet, when cities were bombed and modern supply vanished, it was these quiet jars and sand barrels that kept children fed and mothers alive. A single egg, still good in March, cracked open like a miracle. But not every household had eggs, and not every survivor had sand. So they turned to something even older, a preservation trick that used no jars, no crates, only fat, fire, and the will to stretch a meal beyond time. Number 3, meat preserved. Under-rendered fat. When meat was too rare to waste and refrigeration no longer existed, families didn't eat more. They preserved better. Across France, Belgium, and parts of rural Germany, the confit method, once a regional tradition, became a wartime survival tactic. It was simple, ancient, and brutally effective. Cook meat slowly, then bury it under a seal of its own fat. Confit didn't require ice boxes or storage rooms, just fire, clean containers, and time. Goose, duck, pork, whatever protein could be spared, was first salted and left to cure overnight. Then it was simmered at low heat in its own rendered fat until tender. Once cooked, the meat was packed tightly into ceramic crocks or tin cans. Then the fat was poured over it, forming an airtight barrier that locked out light, air, and spoilage. Done properly, this sealed meat lasted for months. In cool cellars, even longer. During blackouts in Vichy, France, and blockades across Eastern Europe, families relied on confit jars hidden in basements, pantries, and buried caches. One jar could hold meals for a week. Soldiers home on leave would bring fat back from the front, not as luxury, but as preservation gold. In Poland and parts of Yugoslavia, lard was traded like currency, used not for frying, but for sealing away meat from rats, air, and decay. The method had rules. Fat had to be strained, free of water or food particles. Any moisture would spoil the batch. Jars had to be sterilized, often in boiling water. Storage areas had to be cool and dark. Too warm and the fat would melt. Too cold and it cracked. Once opened, the meat had to be eaten quickly or recovered immediately. Families rationed it by the spoonful. A small shred is added to the stew, a slice laid over stale bread. Some mixed it with lentils, root vegetables, or boiled grain to stretch every ounce. Others scraped the fat to fry onions or coat potatoes because even the sealing layer was edible, rich in energy. But this wasn't gourmet. It was grief management, a way to hold on to what little was left. Children were taught not to disturb the fat layer. Mothers watched the jars for bubbles, signs of danger. There was no room for waste, no second chances. When butcher shops closed and animals vanished from pastures, these crocks became the last reserve, a hidden meal in a world with none. Yet even fat runs out, and when it did, civilians reached deeper into memory. preserving, without jars, without meat, without even fire. They reached for what salt water could save. Number 4. Vegetable fermentation in salt brine. When fresh greens vanished and cold killed every garden, salt water kept life going. Fermentation wasn't optional during World War II. It was survival. With no access to refrigeration and no guarantee of supply, civilians across Europe returned to a method older than war itself: preserving vegetables in brine. This wasn't pickling in vinegar. That was a luxury. This was lactic acid fermentation. Just salt, water, time, and patience. Cabbage, carrots, turnips, beets, whatever could be grown or gathered, were shredded, chopped, or sliced, then packed into large stone crocks or glass jars. Salt was layered between every handful, not to flavor, but to draw out moisture, create brine, and keep rot at bay. Once pressed down, the vegetables released liquid. In a matter of days, bacteria took over, the good kind, lactobacillus. It consumed sugars and produced lactic acid, creating a hostile environment for mold, yeast, and decay. That's how sauerkraut, sour turnips, and fermented beetroot made it through entire winters. Across the Balkans and German countryside, families kept fermentation crocks under stairwells and floorboards. In Soviet cities under siege, civilians used any container they could find: ammo tins, clay pots, wooden buckets lined with wax. In some cases, fermentation was the only method available when salt itself was rationed. So brine was reused. Crops were diluted, anything to stretch another week. There were risks. Too little salt and mold grew. Too much and fermentation stalled. If vegetables floated above the brine, they rotted. So civilians used stones, wooden lids, or even glass weights to keep contents submerged. And yet, even with its limits, fermentation delivered something rare in wartime: nutrition. Fermented vegetables retained vitamin C, B12, and gut-stabilizing microbes. In Leningrad's blockade and in Berlin's blackout zones, kraut and brined root mash kept people alive when scurvy crept in and stomachs failed. Children learned the signs of good ferment: sour, not putrid; bubbled, not foamed. Mothers passed down ratios by memory: 2 tablespoons of salt per quart, or until it tasted like a tear. There were no measuring spoons, just hands, instincts, and trial. The fermentation smell became a winter scent: tangy, sharp, and oddly comforting. It meant something was working, something was still being made. And if it froze, even better. Ice slowed fermentation but didn't kill it. Some crocks sat outside under snow, dug out only when needed, because even when heat failed, bacteria worked. But not every home had salt, and not every crop could ferment. Some food had to survive without brine, fire, or cellars. It had to dry before time ran out. Number 5. Open air drying on balcony lines. When fuel was too scarce to boil and jars were too precious to fill, civilians turned to the sun. Drying wasn't a backup plan. It was a frontline defense against spoilage. In southern Europe and occupied urban zones where space was limited and electricity unreliable, families began stringing up their food like laundry. Fruits, vegetables, grains, even strips of meat, anything that could be dried, was. In cities like Naples, Marseille, and Belgrade, entire apartment blocks transformed into silent food preservation networks. Sheets of cloth hung from windows, wire lines stretched between balconies, apple slices, tomato skins, mushrooms, and green beans lay flat, exposed to heat, air, and time. Meat strips, rubbed with salt, were pinned between boards or suspended from hooks in attic rafters. Bread crusts were sliced thin and dried for use in soups. Even herbs were harvested wild and hung upside down near chimneys to retain oils and scent. This wasn't passive work. It required constant movement. Families rotated pieces to avoid mold, pulled in cloths during rain, covered trays with mesh to keep off flies. Timing was everything. Too short, and moisture returned. Too long, and food turned brittle, flavorless, or blew away in the wind. But when done right, dried foods could last weeks, even months. Apples became tart, leathery snacks. Tomato paste was sun-baked onto flat rocks, scraped off later, and stored in jars without refrigeration. Mushrooms shrank into brittle coins, ready to spring back in hot broth. Nothing was wasted. Every peel, stalk, and scrap that could be dried was repurposed. In Yugoslav towns, children were taught how to test dryness by sound. If it cracked cleanly, it was safe. If it bent, it went back in the sun. In Athens, rooftops became preservation zones. In rural Spain, barn rafters became lines of preservation. Beans strung like necklaces, drying in silence. The real genius wasn't in the drying itself. It was in how people adapted urban spaces to mimic countryside techniques. A single windowsill became a food bank. A shared rooftop became a lifeline. The war took factories, markets, and machines. But it couldn't take the sun, and it worked. Dried food didn't need jars, it didn't need electricity, just knowledge, patience, and the will to prepare for days when nothing fresh would come again. But even dried food has a limit. And when dairy began to spoil and winter turned cellars damp, civilians turned upward, not to the sky, but to the attic, where cheese could still breathe, and time still had value. Number 6. Cloth-wrapped hard cheeses in attics. When milk turned sour in hours and butter melted before noon, only one form of dairy stood its ground: cheese. But not all cheese survived the blackout. Only the hard wheels, wrapped in cloth and stored above eye level, made it through the war. In war-torn homes from the Italian Alps to rural Austria, attics became quiet vaults of calories, not because they were convenient, but because they were dry, elevated, and still cool enough to slow spoilage. Families learned that cheese could survive not just without refrigeration, but because of it. Hard cheeses like aged Gouda, cheddar, or Alpine Tom were made specifically for time. The drier they became, the longer they lasted. Once fully pressed and salted, they were wrapped in breathable cloth, cotton, muslin, or old linen, then smeared with vinegar, lard, or even ashes to create a microbial barrier against mold. Attics, unused rafters, even hollowed wall spaces, all were used to store these wrapped wheels. Air could circulate. Moisture stayed low. Rodents stayed out, mostly. The key wasn't just where the cheese was kept, but how it was prepared. In Hungary and northern Italy, civilians rotated the wheels every week to prevent moisture buildup. Clothes were re-oiled or re-vinegared monthly. In Normandy, chalk markings on the wall tracked aging times, and children were warned not to touch the winter wheels. These cheeses weren't food for today, they were surviving for tomorrow. And they were versatile. A single wedge could be shaved into porridge, stirred into boiled grains, or melted into vegetable broth. Even the rind, tough and sharp, was sliced and softened in soup for depth. No part was wasted, not in wartime. But mistakes carried consequences. Cheese stored too low absorbed cellar damp and grew black mold. Stored too high near chimney flues, it dried too fast and cracked. Some families lost entire batches from one wrong season. Still, those who got it right had something rare: protein and fat that didn't rot, energy that didn't depend on supply chains. In the chaos of war, a hidden wheel of cheese became a currency of its own. It could be traded for grain, shared with neighbors, or held until spring when the goats gave milk again. These wheels sat in silence, aging in shadow, waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for hunger to come again. But there was still one more trick, a way to keep perishables cool even when the attic grew hot and the cellar too damp. It didn't require power, just clay, air, and memory. Number 7. Charcoal-cooled pot systems, Zier pot adaptation. When every block lost power and the air reeked of diesel and dust, refrigeration didn't disappear. It adapted. In dry zones of North Africa, southern Italy, and occupied Greece, families revived a method that needed no wires, no fuel, just clay, charcoal, and breath from the wind. It was called many things. evaporative cooling, charcoal coolers, clay and clay storage. But the logic was always the same. Stack two unglazed pots, one inside the other, fill the gap with moist charcoal or sand, and let nature do what it always had. As water evaporated from the porous clay and wet filler, it drew heat from the inner chamber, dropping the temperature inside by up to 10 degrees. In war zones where butter soured by noon and milk spoiled by sunrise, this difference was survival. These pot coolers kept yogurt thick, berries firm, and cooked leftovers edible for days longer than open air. Materials weren't hard to find. Clay pots came from markets, old farmhouses, or even bombed-out kilns. Charcoal was scavenged from cooking fires. The trick lay in how it was assembled. The inner pot had to be small, clean, and dry. The outer pot, wide and porous. Charcoal had to be fine enough to hold moisture, yet loose enough to allow airflow. Families buried the base slightly into cool soil to stabilize it. Then they soaked the charcoal gap with water, just enough to saturate, not flood. A wet cloth was draped across the top, creating a crude seal. And then they waited. With a slight breeze and a dry climate, the results were near miraculous. Dairy kept longer, fruit held color, even meat could be cooled for an extra day, long enough to plan the next fire or find the next meal. In Crete, families built these pots near open windows for maximum airflow. In Algeria, they suspended them on wooden frames to avoid ground heat. Some lined the base with dried mint leaves to repel insects. Others used them to store medicine, yeast cultures, or soaked legumes. But this technique had limits. It failed in humidity. It required daily maintenance, topping off water, checking the charcoal, keeping the cloth clean, and in freezing winters, the pots cracked from thermal shock. Still, for families with no other option, the system extended life, quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't high-tech. It wasn't even new, but it worked when nothing else did. The war stripped away machines, but it couldn't erase ingenuity. When food had to last without a switch, people turned to clay and coal. And somehow, against blackout and hunger, they made time cold again. In World War II, survival wasn't heroic. It was hidden. It lived in clay pots buried in dirt, in jars sealed with fat, in bread baked with bark and silence. Families didn't wait for help. They became their own infrastructure. No fridges, no freezers, no guarantees, just hands that remembered and minds that adapted. Today, we depend on buttons, on apps, on systems built to never fail. But they fail. And when they do, most won't know how to keep a single meal from spoiling. But the ones who remember, who study what their ancestors did with nothing, will have an edge no technology can replicate. Because these methods weren't alternative, they were the standard. And for those willing to learn, they still work. Every technique in this video once kept a family fed while cities fell and winters stretched too long. They weren't hacks. They were lifelines. So if you believe this knowledge should never die, if you want to rebuild resilience in a world of blind dependence, then don't just watch history. Subscribe to it. Because the next video, what we're about to reveal, makes these 7 look easy.